Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the SMI Council, a very warm welcome, Kate Mila Fáilte, to our summer lecture series. In response to the challenging weeks that we've all shared, we want to continue the sense of community that the SMI is famous for, to draw members together, and we're looking at new ways of achieving this. So I'm really happy that Wolfgang will launch our summer series on Bloomsday this evening. Wolfgang is Associate Professor in Musicology at University College Dublin, and he's a member of the UCD Humanities Institute. His main research interests are the representation of death in music, liturgy, post-truth and music, and the theory of musical genres. Recent publications reflect his broad range of interests on Ligeti's writings, opera in Ireland, the history of conservatoires of music in Ireland, and his own commitment to his teaching in UCD also shines through his very active online presence and deep commitment to public musicology. He's a regular contributor to Talking History on News Talk, for example. Wolfgang is currently editing a book on music and death, as well as preparing a volume to celebrate Ligeti's centenary in 2023. He's also well known as general editor of the Dublin Death Studies series. In his abstract, Wolfgang raises some very poignant questions. How can we find our bearings in a world that is in turmoil, that sees high ideals clashing with low instincts, lofty words with horrendous deeds, national and international laws with gratuitous violence? How can we even describe and understand our multifaceted, ideological fractured societies, he asks. In his lecture this evening, Wolfgang is going to illustrate how the German composer Bernd Alois Zimmermann grappled with these questions all his life and made his most ambitious attempt to answer them with the Requiem for a Young Poet, composed in 1969. He's going to show how Zimmermann combined a collage of pre-existing material with avant-garde compositional techniques, and how in that collage he juxtaposed poetry, literature, including extracts both from Ulysses and Finnegans Wake, political speeches, legal texts, and music from Beethoven to the Beatles with the words of the Requiem Mass and electronic sounds. Wolfgang will illuminate for us how Zimmermann's Requiem bears testimony not only to the composer's deep musical sensitivity, but also his political and societal conscience. The title of his lecture is In Extreme Necessity, Streams of Conscience and Consciousness in Bernd Alois Zimmermann's Requiem for a Young Poet. Wolfgang, everyone in council and everyone listening to and present really appreciates your willingness to share your work on a new platform. I'm deeply grateful to you for launching our summer series and also for helping SMI to draw people together. So we're very sincerely grateful for your work that you've put into this evening's lecture. So I'll hand over to you, Wolfgang. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, and thank you very much also for inviting me to this series and also to the entire council of the SMI for this idea and for making me part of it. So Bernd Alois Zimmermann is a composer that was quite well known and important in Germany in the 1950s and 60s in particular, but my impression is he's not that well known outside of the German-speaking countries. And so I think it's a good opportunity to highlight him and highlight one of his main pieces tonight. It is, of course, a special challenge because it's Bloomsday. And Bloomsday, we have to do something about joys, but luckily enough, as Lorraine mentioned, as part of the collage or montage piece that this Requiem for a Young Poet is, there are also references, and actually quite extensive references, to Joyce's two main novels, and not just Ulysses, but also Finnegans Wake. So what I want to do is I want to introduce you to the piece, of course, but also try to put it into a context and also try then to make links or create links to our situation today, which, while in detail, of course, different, in the broad principles and challenges maybe is not that different. Just a few brief introductional remarks on Zimmermann's life. He was born in 1918, died in 1970. He was from near Cologne in the Rhineland and spent more or less his entire life there. He was a soldier for a few years in the Second World War. He was in France and in Russia, but was then invalided out in 1942. He wrote not just art music, but also a lot of music for amateur choruses, dance orchestras, radio dramas, or film music, particularly in the 1950s, partly because he had to in order to make money, partly, but also because he benefited from that in terms of getting to know his techniques and expanding them. He then became a lecturer at Cologne, both at the university and later at the conservatory, the Hochschule. His probably best known and most important piece is the opera Die Soldaten, The Soldiers, from 1965, which had a very long gestation period, and there was a very long struggle that took a lot out of him to get this eventually performed. And he often, well, not complained publicly, but in private, because he was born in 1918, he felt like he was a bit of an in-between generation that he represented, falling between the cracks of an older generation that had still made a career before National Socialism came to power, and a younger generation that started their career straight away after the war, most importantly with Stockhausen. And he was 10 years or so behind, and he never really felt he was a bit lost in that area. Now, let's start by quoting from a letter that he wrote just before the premiere of the Requiem to Michael Gielen, who was the conductor of this first performance. And this is where my title comes from. In extreme necessity, there are performances that have to take place, even under the most difficult conditions, since the time of their performance is of elemental importance for the composer's spiritual existence. That is the case here. Remember 1965, that was the time when the piece had to be given, I mean, Die Soldaten. In the case of the Requiem, its importance is even greater. I do not write this because I've never felt as strongly as I do now, but because simply everything depends on it. And that is an objective matter of fact. So this shows us an enormous emotional commitment to this piece, but also a commitment to what it stands for, and we'll shortly see what that is. In the score, it is designated as Lingual, for 2 speakers, soprano and bass solo, 3 choirs, orchestra, a jazz combo, and electronic sounds based on texts by diverse poets, on reports, and also accounts. There's also an organ that's not listed here, and there are no violins and no violas in the orchestra, but there are a few other instruments that normally might not always expect, saxophones, for instance, or an accordion. It was premiered late in 1969 in Düsseldorf, and unfortunately, Zimmermann was ill and could not attend, even though he was so committed to it, as we just saw. In the end, he could not attend the premiere, and he could never hear this piece live. The structure of the piece is complex, and it falls into 2 different parts, generally speaking. So you see here 6 movements, but they are very different in length. The first one, which can be subdivided into 3 sections, prologue, Requiem 1 and 2, is almost 40 minutes long. And that's about 2/3 of the entire duration of the piece, which is about 65 minutes long. And then you can see below where I have those Italian titles, where it's all much shorter. And then the Dona, nobis, pacem, the reference to a Requiem, well, it's actually not a Requiem text, but we'll get to that, is a bit longer again. And the first movement consists to a large extent on pre-recorded sounds, pre-recorded speeches, and electronic sounds. There's also some live music, but it's always dominated by what comes from the tapes. Whereas in the other sections below, this is not the case. And this is why some of the musicologists who wrote about this called the first part something like a radio play, more akin to that. The second one, a cantata or an oratorio. Cantata is something that Zimmermann himself used at some point when describing this piece, which had a very long gestation period. He thought about it first in the mid to late 50s in broad terms, and then started collecting texts that he wanted to use, although the actual compositional process was mainly taking place between 67 and 69. Jörn Peter Hickel, who has written the most extensive study of this Requiem based on a PhD thesis that was then published, describes his main working method as such. The material is structured along the lines of a Joycean stream of consciousness, with its characteristic tendency to juxtapose associated ideas without any logical sequence or syntax. The last bit is maybe a little bit harsh on occasion, as we shall see. But yes, it's, there are things that you wouldn't normally expect to come together, thrown together. And the question is, does it make sense? Do you actually sense something new, a whole coming out of that? He uses the following sources, which come in 8 languages, most of them, all of them actually European, from Latin and ancient Greek to contemporary European languages. All these sources are from Europe, with the exception of Chairman Mao, but the texts by him are actually translated into German. So we have, at the beginning, for quite a while, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the opening sections of the philosophical investigations. I don't think that Wittgenstein has been set to music very often. Then you have a sort of a double act of sections of the German basic law, the constitution, juxtaposed with quotes by Chairman Mao. Then you have a range of politicians that you can see there, or say leaders, including the Pope, John the 23rd. And they are always there with original recordings. So it's the original voices that we hear in the respective languages. Then we have literary sources, and I include here the Bible in that, the Latin Bible. And these are not original, well, even for those who were still alive around the time, these are not original voices, these are readings that were recorded. And then we have musical quotes from Beethoven, Wagner, Viau, Messiaen, Zimmermann himself, and the Beatles. And you hear some of those later as well. In the score, there is a sketch that indicates how the forces that perform this are to be positioned. And you can see here, this is drums. I think it's meant to be symmetrical. It's not the case that they're meant to be more people sitting on the right. But you see on top, north, so to speak, the main podium, which has the orchestra and choir 1. Behind the audience, south, we have choir 2. And then choir 3 is divided up in half and is both left and right, so that the audience is surrounded by sources of sound. And then you can see in the corners, those 4 little black dots, those are loudspeakers, and there are 4 more loudspeakers above the respective choruses. Those are little white indications there. So there are altogether 8 loudspeakers that produce the taped sounds. 4 of them produce the language bits, and the other 4 produce electronic sounds or pre-recorded music. So the idea is that we are really surrounded by sound all the time. And there is no way that this piece could in any way be experienced adequately by listening to a CD, let alone by listening to something that comes out of a laptop speaker. So this is always an approximation only. And this is also important, I think, when it comes to trying to distinguish and differentiate between different layers of text. You will hear things that sound like it's total chaos between voices, but I think if it was experienced live, you could actually distinguish things that come from behind you, from your left, from your right, and that would be easier to understand, to focus on one thing at a time or to move the thoughts around. Experienced that myself once when I sung in Ives' 4th Symphony in a chorus and was in the middle of the performers, and you can hear all these different layers of key signatures and quotes that come together much more easily live than in a recording. Now, let's talk about language, his use of language, and first maybe the term lingual. That is, it sounds like a generic term, but he invented it for this. Wolf Konold, who wrote about the piece in the 80s, read it as a combination of lingua, Latin for language, and ritual, and everybody else has followed him in that. So it's a combination of those two things, presumably. It uses spoken words, it uses sung words, and it uses what Zimmermann called a third level between language and music. So that is not something like Schönberg's Sprechgesang. It's rather an understanding of language, even if it is not sung, having musical qualities in terms of the rhythm in which it flows, in terms of the sounds that it creates. And he selects language not just from the point of view of the meaning that the words convey, but also how they fit together from an aesthetic, musical point of view. So he focuses on the aesthetic quality of sound as a single line in combination with other sounds or speeches, and different languages side by side on occasion, different versions of the same speech or the same words set against each other in different tempi or in a kind of a polyphonic fugal, we call that ricercar at some point, structure. Also, words can be electronically altered, filtered, or get reverb, and so run against each other in that. He begins, as I already mentioned, with Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. And that is, of course, a study of language and how we use it. And that is very important to Zimmermann. It is, this quote, the longest quotation in the entire work. It runs more or less for 11 minutes out of the 65. And in it, Wittgenstein introduces this concept of language games. He argues that how we learn language, he quotes St. Augustine, and who said in his Confessions that we learn it because somebody wants it, my father, my mother. So I look at that and I realize this thing is called stone or door or something. It's actually the use, the play, the use in which the context in which we use it, not just that pointing or not mainly that pointing. And we don't know, there has been speculation to what extent Zimmermann may have actually looked into Wittgenstein and read it and studied it. We don't know that for certain. Maybe he just also liked just the word, the term language games, because what he does in the Requiem is certainly some kind of language game. Just as an example, which to me sounds very much like a Finnegans Wake-like play with words. There is in the Requiem the word lux perpetua, in the introit, for example, the eternal light. There's also the German word that sounds exactly the same way, lux spelled with CHS, which is links in English. And this word features in Ezra Pound's text that he quotes. And he quotes that first in English, but then at some later point, he translates some lines into German, and he lets those two things run against each other so that there's a lux in one line and a lux in another. And that is interesting then, because you sometimes are not quite sure who is now singing or speaking which part, because both use the same word. Now, there, as an example of polyphonic speech, sorry, I have here an extract from the first movement, Requiem 1 section, which goes back to Finnegans Wake, the final section of that, the monologue of Anna Livia Plurabelle, the embodiment of the river Liffey that flows through Dublin. And you can see here some of the text that he uses. I hope you can read that. My leaves have drifted from me, for example. I start with the first sound example in a moment, a bit before that, and we go into that. But I want to show you how that continues, because it goes into a quote from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, Isolde's Liebestod. You can see that there is that kind of a cross-hatched area, which again, you see has up to 6 layers of sounds come from this choice code dissection at the same time. They all say the same things, but not at the same time. And we hold in the middle this black moment. It says the anfahrende Panzer, that is tanks just about to start getting to move. And before that, you will hear, don't have that here in, a crowd, an excited crowd. So let's hear them.
Also your double robes.
Here's your shirt.
Comforter as well.
Come back and hear your ivory done. Nevertheless, drifted from your unsteadiness. Straight. Once I see you.
Okay, we got a bit of the accordion there as well. So of course, what happens here, this is the end of the novel, insofar as the novel has an end. And This means the river Liffey is to reach the sea, Dublin Bay, and therefore somehow metaphorically to die. And that is the motivation to use this music by Wagner, which is also dying out of love. And so this brings these two elements together at this point. Another example of the use of words for musical purposes, not polyphonic in this case, is a poem by the Hungarian Sandor Weöres, one of the most acclaimed Hungarian poets of the 20th century. And this was something Zimmermann got because he knew somebody who in turn knew Weöres. This poem was not yet published when he composed it. It was only published a year later after the premiere, but he got his hands on it. And you can see it consists essentially of three words, the Hungarian words for silence, peace, and light. And there is no syntax here really. He just sort of shuffles these three words around in groups of 1 or 2 or 3 and links them somehow. It is not really about a semantic message that comes with that. It is more about the sound of these words. And this is actually used quite a lot at different points in the Requiem. And I'm going to play to you now one version of it, which is the Elegia movement in the middle, one of those short movements, the only movement we're going to listen to in its entirety because it's just under 2 minutes. And this is sung by a soprano soloist and by the jazz combo, accompanied by the jazz combo, which has certain elements, and the soprano as well, where it's not precisely notated necessarily. There are certain elements we can slide up and down or sort of stretch things a bit in order to have an improvisational, a bit of an improvisational element here. There also, at some point, is the option to use quarter tones. This is not the entire poem, by the way, it's just the first stanza. There are a few more words coming up later. And it's also the only time this is actually sung. When it's used before in the piece, it is usually spoken. And often this is sort of split up between different speakers and different tapes, so that again, you get a kind of a spatial effect that is coming with that, which is not the case here. The title, Dop, Esh, Tánc, drums and dance, is actually interesting because those words don't actually feature in the poem at all. It's more metaphorical. Now, let's move on to Zimmermann's philosophy of time and the way in which it affects and shapes this piece. He has a famous phrase, the spherical nature of time, or in German, die Kugelgestalt der Zeit, which he sort of coined, and which is almost always the first thing that is mentioned when people talk about his music. What does that mean? It means that to him, he says, time is not really linear in the sense we normally in daily life experience or talk about it. In a way, the past and the future are as close to us as the present is. We should imagine time not as something linear, but bent on itself forming something like the surface of a sphere. And I, the subject relating to time, I'm at the center of that sphere. So any moment in time is somewhere on the surface of that sphere. And any point on the surface of the sphere is as distant or close to me in the center as any other point. And so this kind of, it's a metaphorical way of expressing this view that it's all simultaneous more or less, because, and that's the third point here, where it's all shaping us equally. One, the past through memory, the present through experience, Anschauung in German, and the future through expectation, Erwartung. All three are equally relevant in shaping us and sort of making us what we are and make us act the way we do. So that, for him, then leads to an embracing of pluralism. Again, that's what he called it, as a compositional style, where you can use quotations, stylistic quotations in terms of music, in terms of texts from many different periods, eras, but also geographical locations. It's all as close or distant to us as any other thing in terms of what it means to us. And he stated, and that's again maybe a good thing today on Bloomsday, that his techniques of collage and montage were more influenced by modern literature, and particularly Joyce and Pound, and modern painting, particularly surrealists, than by contemporary music. Now I want to show you a very brief extract from a documentary made by the filmmaker Saskia Walker, German, who gave me graciously the link to this documentary and also allowed me to show you an extract from it. It's entitled Das Bliesheimer Kreuz, the Bliesheim Cross. Bliesheim is the place, the village where Zimmermann was born, not far from Cologne, and also by chance where Saskia Walker was born. And it is today mainly known as the name of a motorway junction. So you approach it and there's a big sign, Bliesheimer Kreuz, but it's of course also metaphorically the cross that he had to carry, or that he felt he had to carry. So there we go. So it comes with English subtitles, so I hope you can see that. We hear Heinz Holliger, Swiss composer and oboist.
Ihm war eben wichtig, dass alle Essenzen des Lebens auch gleichzeitig eben zur Sprache kommen. Und darum wurde er dann auch zum einzigen ganz großen Collagisten, der das wirklich konnte, ohne dass man das Gefühl gehabt hatte, er gehe einfach so in einen Gemischtwarenladen und bediene sich aus jeder historischen Schublade mit irgendwas und bringe das zusammen, wie das in den meisten dieser Collagestücke eigentlich der Fall ist. Bei ihm sind diese Gleichzeitigkeit von verschiedenen Stilen eine Art wie ein Kaleidoskop. Ich denke oft so an ein mittelalterliches Totentanzbild, wo fast die ganze Menschheit plötzlich so in einer Masse zusammengefasst ist, arm und reich und alt und jung und Kulturen, die weit viele hundert Jahre auseinander sind, plötzlich in einem Bild so in den Brennpunkt kommen. Und das ist eigentlich, was zum Beispiel Weöres ausdrückt, aber auch das Requiem ganz sicher. Und für mich ist das Einzigartige in der heutigen Musik. Ich kann das eher über bildliche Vorstellungen auch Parallelen finden, eben wenn ich jetzt bei Bosch oder was auch immer mich inspirieren lasse.
So I hope you could see those subtitles. I think the main point here is when he says that Zimmermann was the only great collage composer who created something new and unique when juxtaposing those stylistic elements, when bringing these seemingly disparate things together. The question is always, is what comes out of it more than the sum of its parts? And he clearly thinks it is. And also interesting, this comparison he makes of this kind of putting together very disparate things to the Danse Macabre and to paintings by Hieronymus Bosch, such as maybe Garden of Earthly Delights, where all sorts of society, different people, different old and young, as he says, rich and poor, come together. So that is interesting because he doesn't actually talk about the Requiem here. He talks about the style in general, but it's of course of particular relevance when we talk about a Requiem. Now, another thing, another term that he talked about in German, Zeitdehnung, or extension of time, where he sort of looks at different parts, be they live performed parts or be they the duration of sections on tape, and makes sure that they relate to each other in certain proportions. And the most important proportion is the tritone, which, depending on what tuning system you believe in, there are different proportions that you can have. He uses 7:5 because that is the easiest one in a way. And that point, if you divide 7 by 5, you get 1.4 approximately. And that is often determined to find out or to fix the duration of sections in relation to each other. So when you saw earlier, for instance, the bit where the texts from Finnegans Wake run at different points in time, so there were different points in where they were. This is partly because the duration is stretched in some parts in relation to other parts because they follow such a proportion. So what it does is it allows a pitch component, an interval, to determine other parameters. So turning a vertical aspect into a horizontal component. This is, of course, one of the basic principles of total serialism, that you have 12-tone technique, not just in relation to the pitches, but you also have similar parameters in relation to other components. He never does that completely, but as a principle, so that have a vertical component influencing a horizontal component, he does that too. The tritone is very important in other contexts too. There are 12-tone series that he uses in the piece, not permanently. It's not a 12-tone composition every now and then. He also every now and then uses techniques such as inversion and retrograde. He doesn't use this permanently. He doesn't want to be constrained by one particular style, but he uses it every now and then. And to show you, we are not going to listen to that because you wouldn't hear, no one can hear that. But the way in which this can be used, for instance, as Hickel has pointed out, in one of the middle movements, Rappresentazione, there's a phrase sung by tenors and then accompanied by piano 1. And there's another phrase sung by basses and accompanied by piano 2. One is 24 bars long, the other one is 34.5 bars long. If you divide that, B divided by A, you get 1.4375, which equals 1.4, i.e. that tritonous number. And the same can be said with regard to the number of occurrences of these phrases, because B occurs 13 times and A occurs 9 times. If again you divide that, you get 1.44, again approximating 1.4. So there is an element where there is an enormous amount of detail going into the structure of those live composed performed parts, and also into the tape parts with regard to their duration. Then we have different variants in different parts. This is the beginning of the Dona nobis pacem. And I'm going to play that now. This is not all of it. There are more instruments below. We have here mainly the choral parts. And there is tape coming back on top. And this, when it comes in, will immediately try to sort of completely focus your attention away from the chorus. But I would like you to ask you to try to keep focus on the choral parts, the ones we see here. Okay, so what did we see here? Now is another experiment here with how that works. If we take the first, say, 5 notes here, and then we take the first notes here, and actually we don't have all of this, we only have the first 2 notes here. What you see here is the first pitch goes down, the line goes down, a semitone back to where it came from, up a major second, again back to where it came from. If you look at the next entry, it goes here down from A to G sharp, A, B, A. Same thing, just a note higher. And here you can see a B followed by an A flat, and we can't see more, but it is in fact, if you follow it on, the same thing is happening again. So they all have the same melodic shape, and it continues like that if you go further. but they have different rhythms. The rhythms are not in specific proportions. You can see here, it starts with a minim. Up here, we have actually a minim and quaver. So it's then we have a dotted quaver, a crotchet here. We have, this is 2 beats long altogether. So this is longer than that. So the first note here is shorter than that one there. This one is actually longer. So the whole thing, this one is even longer. So melodically similar, rhythmically different, and rhythmically not different systematically. And it's not like in medieval music where you might have everything one goes in, let's say, in an isorhythmic thing or so, or in maybe perfect and imperfect mensuration or something. Nothing like that. The rhythm is independent, but the melody is not. And this is something that, again, happens a lot. There are also more or less isorhythmic areas. Let me just delete that elsewhere. So we have that bit that shows, again, another way in which rhythmic variants indicate the freedom of time with which he operates. So if we go to the next bit, the clash of secular and sacred elements coming together, and then secular conflicts sometimes taking over. Of course, originally the Requiem is a genre of sacred music, but already in the 19th century, certainly in the 20th, it is very rarely a sacred genre anymore. And one thing that happens again in the first movement, in the middle section, Requiem 1, is a clash, as it were, between the German constitution, the Grundgesetz or basic law, versus quotes by Mao Zedong. And the constitution, the basic law, always is from the beginning, so the really foundational laws. The human dignity cannot be touched, or all human beings are equal before the law, things like that. So these are positive things that were, of course, formulated shortly after the end of the Second World War and the end of the Nazi period, in order to sort of try to prevent this from happening again. This is countered each time by Mao, who sort of says things like what you can see, a revolution is a violent act in which one class overthrows another. So not all human beings are indeed not equal before the law. And these things clash. And this happens 3 times over the course of this section of the first movement. Each time it gets more heated, it gets more exercised, both of them. And we hear now the 3rd time, the last of those. You actually hear at the start in the background, Alexander Dubček speaking in Czech. He was the leader of the Czechoslovakia, as it was then, during the Prague Spring in 1968. So just quite recently at the time this was written. And so these two clash, and it says actually in the score, through a megaphone, almost shouting when you get to this point.
Drahí moji spoluobčania, družky a sudruhovia, ťažko sa vyhľadajú slova, ktorými by som
Jeder hat das Recht auf Leben und körperliche Unversehrtheit. Die Freiheit der Person ist unverletzlich. In diese Rechte darf nur aufgrund eines Gesetzes eingegriffen werden. Die Revolution ist ein Aufstand. Artikel 3. Ein Gewaltakt. Alle Menschen, die vor dem Gesetz eine andere Klasse stürzt.
Of the opening words, Requiem Aeternam, which actually in this case follows the highest pitch, which is cut off here, but it will outline the Gregorian melody. Requiem Aeternam, if we let that run through. So occasionally he does that, something like that too. And these exclamations happen a few times throughout the movement. This is a 12-tone chord, all 12 pitches are in it. It's very static and very dissonant because of that. Again, sacred and secular spheres. This is the section we just heard earlier, the opening of the Dona nobis pacem. And we saw how this melodic line is done in different rhythms in all vocal parts. But there's another aspect to it. And for that, we again have to go to another screen here. Listen to this, you might know it, but to this piece. So now we again have to note something here. We have to take this note, that note, and I think it's this one. So these are, so to speak, wrong. The two F sharps should be up a second, should be Gs. The B should be down, down should be an A. And if we assume that, then the pitches we have is here, and so on. It's that tune. So he takes a song that is a worker song, that is a socialist and communist song. He takes that tune and uses it to set this originally liturgical text. So again, sacred and secular spheres here combined. And because it's much slower, it doesn't have that march rhythm, I don't think anybody will really hear that. Also because, as you heard earlier, it's polyphonic, so that it happens on top of each other, not at the same time. But it's there, and it can be found. And if you know it and hear it, then maybe you then will hear it. Probably not when you don't know it. And again, so we've now heard the beginning of this movement, the last movement, Dona nobis pacem, twice. We heard the Dona nobis pacem itself. We already heard the extract from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, beginning first movement, which is this chaos moment, which then leads to the notations or reference to the previous movements before the Ode to Joy theme takes over. The Beatles' Hey Jude. What follows, and we haven't heard that yet, so I let that run now, is politicians, leaders from the Second World War. Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, addressing the Soviet government. Stalin addressing the Russian people just after the German invasion. Goebbels with his famous speech where he asked the German people, do you want total war? And then Churchill, and I think it cuts off right at that point. The end of this movement is a single line of text, quote from Konrad Bayer, an Austrian poet, his incomplete novel, Der sechste Sinn, or The Sixth Sense, from 1964, incomplete because he died. And given that this is a movement about war, as we heard, we had those Second World War leaders, and we had underlying it all this ongoing call for peace, Dona nobis pacem. It ends with this, and this is important because this is just after 1968, or maybe during when he actually wrote this, the student revolt. And particularly in Germany, the moment when the younger generation started asking, openly asking their parents and grandparents, where were you What did you see or not see? What did you know during those years from 33 to 45? Well, how did you not realize what was happening? And one of the usual answers is always, well, it didn't happen where I was. I never knew there was a concentration camp. We never saw people beaten up or so. It wasn't local. And he takes this bit, which is originally from a different context, but it fits very well here as a comment on all this. And but at the same time, extremely musical speech again, because as you can see here in the English translation already, it is something that repeats lines and changes a few words and makes it broader in the sense that initially it goes from conditional to indicative to certain. It goes from past tense and present tense back and forth. It goes to a point where at the end it says everybody sees, not just knows, but even sees even more. So it sort of is a critique of that, or at least in this context it is.
Wie jeder weiß, wie jeder wusste, wie alle wussten, wie alle wissen. Wissen das alle? Das können unmöglich alle wissen. Wie manche wissen. Was manche Arbeiter, Bauern, Generale, Staatsmänner wissen. Wie viele Menschen wissen. Was fast alle Menschen wissen. Fast alle Menschen wissen das. Alle Menschen sollten das wissen. Was jeder Mensch wissen sollte. Mancher Mensch weiß das, was ich wusste, wie ich wusste. Wie ich, Marcel Oppenheimer und die Damen wussten. Wie ich und Melita Mendel wissen. Wie Nina und ich wussten. Wie jeder sehen konnte. Wie fast jeder sehen konnte. Wie jeder aus einiger Entfernung sehen konnte. Wie jeder sehen kann. Wie jeder Mensch sehen kann.
This is the end of the piece. So a last exclamation, Dona nobis pacem, give us peace. And this is again one of those dissonant 12-tone chords across all the three choruses all around the audience. Now, often it is said that generally this is a pessimistic piece that says ultimately there are moments when positive powers, for instance, like the basic law, like the Bible is quoted, like some of the literary sources, but then these politicians come in and war, violence, revolution, uprising comes to the fore again. But it ends with this. And I think in a way, it might be called like something like playful obstinacy, the way in which here everything that happened before is criticized. To say, you knew that, didn't you? And I show in a playful way how you could not have known that way. So I'm not so sure that overall, despite of what we know about Zimmermann's own views and what happened to him, that it is negative. We'll see what you make of it later in the discussion. Now, is this actually a requiem in a generic sense? Because as I said earlier, most requiems in the 20th century don't actually follow the tradition of setting the full Latin text. Here is a list of the texts that are set. It contains quite a few bits that are not normally in a requiem, like oratio and lectio. These are proprium texts, not ordinarium text. Ordinarium is what is the same in every single mass, and that is normally in a mass as well as in the requiem mass set. Whereas proprium text is the things that change from week to week, like prayers, readings, hymns, stuff like that. And so he integrates some of those, but altogether he does very little. He uses very little of the Latin text. He has the full sequence, the full offertory is not there. And if we go on, no Sanctus, Agnus Dei is half there, but it's not quite the real one. I'll come back to that in a second. And then again, a post-communion, which is not part, or which is part of the proprium. So by and large, only small sections of the text are used, not in the right order. And there's a lot of proprium texts that most people might not be that familiar with and certainly wouldn't expect in a requiem. But a contemporary requiem is often doing that. I mean, we live in a time now, and I have been for some time, where anything can be called or can be given generic titles like symphony, string quartet, or requiem, or whatever, without necessarily conforming to the generic expectations of having 4 string instruments or having an orchestral sound in a certain number of orchestral, a certain number of movements, or in this case, being a setting of this Latin text. But the title is still important because what people do is, I think they link, when I see this is a Requiem, I think of Mozart, I think of Fauré, I think of Verdi, of all the well-known Requiems. And I sort of have an expectation shaped by those when encountering this piece, and it shapes my perception of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why these generic titles don't die out, even though they no longer conform in structure or functions to the generic norms that were quite well established in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, who's the young poet, actually? In his notes, liner notes for the first performance, Zimmermann wrote, "It is a young poet in general, a poet such as we can imagine may have existed at any point during the last 50 years, in his various dealings with all that determines his intellectual, cultural, historical, and linguistic situation. And hence our own situation, which is that of Europe in the years between 1920 and 1970, coincidentally, Zimmermann's own lifetime. But it is not entirely true, because it is actually about a number of specific people. 3 poets, Sergei Yesenin, who is actually not represented by his own texts, but by something that Vladimir Mayakovsky, the second poet, wrote about him, because Yesenin committed suicide in 1925. Mayakovsky wrote a text in which he criticized committing suicide and told people not to follow Yesenin's example. This seems to have been something like a Sorrow of Young Werther moment in Russia, where there were lots of fans of Yesenin, and there was some of them actually did follow him. However, Mayakovsky himself, 5 years on, also committed suicide. And so not just this text by him, but also his final poem that he wrote just before he took his own life is included. And Konrad Bayer, who wrote this bit that we just listened to a moment ago, also committed suicide, an Austrian poet. So these are 3 prominent poets that died young, around 30, as you can see there, and that certainly can serve as models of those young poets that he talks about. But also Zimmermann himself, who was to die the year after the premiere of the Requiem, and who also committed suicide, could maybe count among them, even though he was a bit older, not that young. But it has been speculated by the musicologists who wrote about this and researched this Requiem that he may already have had an inkling, and maybe have had in part determined it to be for himself. Certainly all 4 were influenced by and reflected in their works the turbulent times in which they lived. Now, Zimmermann committed suicide on the 10th of August, 1970, more or less exactly a year after he finished the score for the Requiem. We have seen he certainly had a strong social and political conscience. We can see that in work titles, such as he wrote something in the 50s called Based on the Spiritual, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, but he tweaked the title, he made it present tense, Nobody Knows the Trouble I See. So that makes it far more direct and immediate to him. The last piece that he finished 5 days before he took his own life has a biblical title from Ecclesiastes, which is, I turned around and looked at all the injustice that happens under the sun. So he has a clear relationship to, or relation to, social and political conscience and how that weighs on him. There are many other things that affected him as well. He suffered from depression for a long time. He never had very good eyesight to begin with, but it deteriorated significantly during the 1960s. It was a glaucoma, and he had been told it was inoperable. He was in financial difficulties, but that was partly because he didn't have enough time to write his compositions. And he twice at least rejected full professorships and only did part-time teaching because he wanted to have time to work on his music, and particularly his second opera, Medea. And he was desperate to work on that and never found enough time to do this because he had a family, 3 children, he had to care for them, so he had to bring in money as well. Personally, he had strong Catholic roots, and to the end, he was a Catholic. He had very devout parents. He went for 7 years to a Catholic boarding school. And you can see here the dedication of the Requiem in honor of Saint Herman Joseph. This is a regional or local saint, the region of Cologne. By the way, the patron saint of watchmakers. I don't know if that has a specific significance for somebody who was such a philosophy about time. But the main thing is this saint is buried in the church of the boarding school, an old monastery in which he stayed. So he had a personal connection. And you can see here the last page, at the end of the page, of the Requiem, OAMDG, Omnia ad Majorem Dei Gloriam. So not that far from what Bach used to do. He wrote that not just here, but generally under his compositions. So he had his ethics, his views were strongly rooted in religion and Catholic beliefs, even though he was also, I think, critical of institutional Catholicism. He uses John the 23rd, the speech, to open the Second Vatican Council, which created a lot of hope in many Catholics around the world in the Requiem. But I'm not sure he was still not focusing with all of this on the afterlife and on purely religious issues. He was focusing on the here and now, which is also something that lots of Requiem composers in the 20th century do. So if you look at Britten War Requiem, at Ligety's Requiem, for example, they are all not about the transcendent sphere and the afterlife. They are about what happens to us in the here and now. So we have a secular focus in our world rather than on the afterlife. This can be called, and sometimes this is called in German, Bekenntnismusik, which can be translated as music of confession or of conscience. We have seen the references to politics, conflicts, and violence regularly. We have seen the link between left-wing thinking, this song, the Marschbrüder zu Sonne zur Freiheit, set as a tune on Dona nobis pacem. We have no Agnus Dei, so when we have this Dona nobis pacem, it's normally introduced, of course, in the Mass by Lamb of God, peace, give us peace. This is left out here, it's just Dona nobis pacem. And also in a Requiem, it should be actually Dona eis Requiem, give us rest, rest, and the third time eternal rest. It's not, he actually changes the text and takes the bit from the normal Mass, not the Requiem Mass, because that's what he wants here, the call for peace, not for eternal rest in the afterlife. So let's go back then to the initial, quote with which I began, in extreme necessity. I think we've seen that it's a clear moment of stream of consciousness thinking in there. He said, he referred his montage technique back to Joyce and others, but Joyce first and foremost. And he felt that there is also a stream of conscience going through that, that has this juxtaposition of dramatic moments where war, violence are mentioned, are related to, and then moments of trying to stem that in some of the texts. And those young poets in particular suffer from that. And of course, they didn't manage to overcome it. They didn't manage to even get to grips with it. They took their own lives. And I'm not quite sure if that's the lesson that we have to take from that. I mean, there are lots of people who like the poetry of Sylvia Plath, for instance, who, without being suicidal necessarily. And I think the same can be said about this. And as I said, I don't think it actually ends in that much of a pessimistic way as some other people seem to think. I would like, therefore, to finish with a link going back to Bloom's Day, for the day that's in it, and the link, the stream of consciousness that we have in all this piece, to read out a few lines from Anna Livia Plurabelle, the final section of Finnegans Wake, which I think, even though it's Bloom's Day and Ulysses Day, therefore this is closer in its thinking and in the stream of consciousness structure to Finnegans Wake than it actually is to Ulysses. I am passing out. Oh, bitter ending. I'd slip away before they are up. They'll never see, nor now, nor miss me. And it's old it's sad, and old it's sad and weary. I go back to you, my cold father, my cold mad father, my cold mad fiery father, till the neat sight of the mere slice of skin. The moils and moils of it, moan and a moaning, makes me sea salt sick, and I rush my only into your arms. I see them rising. Save me from those terrible prongs. 2 more. 2 moments more. So, my leaves have drifted from me, all, but one cling still, I'll bear it on me. To remind me of So soft this morning hours. Yes, carry me along, Tally, like you done through the toy fair. If I seen him beating down on me, now on the widespread wings, like he'd come from Archangels, I think I'd die down over his feet, humbly-dumbly, only to worship. Yes, tit. There's where, first, we passed through Grush, we hush the bush, two, wish, the gulls, far calls, coming far. And here. Thank you very much.